Welcome to another chapter of In the Keep podcast. I'm your very own prophet of the drowned god, the Motherlode. This show is all about the world of first-person shooters, their legacies, their lineage, and the people who keep that world turning. It is the will of the drowned god Cathala that our communities band together to frag and jib one another into oblivion for all eternity. Hello there, keepers of the faith. It is I, Motherlode. This week I bring to you a wonderful interview with the developer of the game Hedon. He goes by the alias Zand, and I really enjoyed this interview for a multitude of reasons, but especially because this is not your typical Doom mod, or, technically this is a full-on new game built in the Doom engine, but this is not your typical thing like that. This is something really special. Zand has spent years, thinking up lore into this. It's not just a Doom clone by any stretch of the imagination. This is a game that has a tremendous amount of tactic and storytelling and immersiveness that you can't compare it to Doom. And we'll really get into that in the interview. But I want to say that I had a great time talking to Zand, and especially one of the more interesting things about him is that he is in fact an architect, and some of the architecture in this game is just below your mind, the level design. And another thing is the way the music plays into this, and these are some really cool tracks that you're going to hear as we get into the intro and then outro of the interview. But just pay a little bit of attention to these and actually try to take it in, because the atmosphere of the game depends heavily on the music. Some of the levels are actually designed around the music, which Zand will get into for a bit in the interview. So this first track that you're going to hear is by Methadone Skies. It is called Exit the Void. You can go check him out on his YouTube channel, which I'll provide in the show links. And the track that you'll hear after the interview is by Alexander Brandon, a veteran of the industry. The song is called One Calm Day, and I'll provide his Bandcamp page also in the episode notes. So, without any more bullshit from me, let's get in the keep with Zand.
Coincidentally sharing the name of the main character from Hedon, which I'm the creator of. For those of you who don't know what Hedon is, it's basically an action-adventure game running on the GZDoom engine and bearing inspiration from basically some older games. Primarily the classic shooters, but not necessarily. It has a bit of RX Fatalis in it. It has a bit of Thief. It's basically like the gameplay functions as a retro shooter with some Hexen-like inventory and exploration segments and puzzles, but it also has some story mixed in, some atmosphere, some exploration segments, so it's not just frantic action all the time.
It's one of the first things that I kind of had to readjust my expectations about when I've played the game. A lot of people, when they read tags like, it's a boomer core, it's classic first-person shooter, that kind of thing, and it has all of those elements, but the reality of Hedon is that the game itself has a lot of very rich storytelling in it that you're kind of required to engage in to progress, and it's not like a lot of people, just want to play like Doom, where like I run through and I kill all the monsters, I find the keys, and I move on.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, Hedon has a lot more of that RPG element to it, and it didn't disappoint me. I don't in any way want to give that impression. I just was kind of caught off guard when I started playing. I was like, oh shit, I've been running around this level for 45 minutes and I have no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I never really mentioned in the description that it's like a Doom, but people assume it's like it because of the engine. So that's why. And I had to struggle quite a bit to like adjust the store description to be more accurate about it.
Now with Hexen, I mean, like that's kind of the first thing you list if anyone goes and looks at the Steam. That's the first thing that comes up, and like that is a very difficult to navigate game and story. Like you do have to spend a lot of time kind of like going around, and even after you've killed all the enemies, figuring out what you're going to do. At least the first time you play it, when you don't really know what you're doing.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also segments where you just have enemies spawning in waves, so that's pretty much goes to like painkiller from
Right.
exploration that goes to dial up to 11.
And for those classic Doom fans, you have some really amazing parts in Hedon where you are put in just a big round arena room and you get to run around in circles and annihilate waves of enemies, and that there's something for everyone in this game is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's the point of design I went with. I wanted to have like a lot of variation in it.
I mentioned the rich storytelling, and I didn't quite appreciate it until I looked more into it. But so you get some like Tolkien level storytelling going on. You've really thought this out over years and years and years of like how you want it.
Yeah, that's very true.
So can you walk us through like who is Zan and like the whole Iron Division, everything? Kind of just give us a brief history.
Yeah, so yeah, with Zan, it started like 10, 11 years ago, 2009, I think, or even earlier a bit. Zan is basically one of my RPG characters, and I was playing World of Warcraft, and I had this troll rogue, which was Zan. So that's where the blue skin comes from, if you want to know. Yeah, and I was quite fond of this character because at that time I had discovered Thief, which, by the way, is my favorite game, if you couldn't tell.
Yeah.
It's by far my number one game. And I was really excited about games that gave me the stealth option because back in the day, having these games that just allow you to play either stealth or shootout weren't really that common. It's more of a post 2010 thingy. And yeah, I grew attached to the character from World of Warcraft. I would use her on the forums since people were used to me being Zan, and that's kind of how I took her alias as my username across different places over the internet. So that's the first stage of Zan, and I would generally make the character Zan in whatever RPG I would play. She was generally this red-haired chick that she was a rogue, so her design was really different. She was like very light and sharp. She wasn't how she is right now. What changed her design was basically later on. I met with I'm Feltacular, which, by the way, is credited in the game, and she became my girlfriend. And later on, yeah, later on we started playing Terra online, which has this stereotypical big, burly, muscular race, which had the only option for blue skin, and that made me sort of like force me to pick it as a character for Zan. So I was, that's pretty interesting. It's a big, burly, muscular character. And if I'm still in a relationship, I might as well assume the traditional role of a tank, and Fail would be the healer, of course. And that's how Big Burly Tanky Zan came to be. It's another step of her development. So yeah, was like 6 years ago, so quite a while ago. And yeah, later on we didn't get to play too much Terra because Fail had some real life stuff going on, and her schedule became too erratic for us to be able to play. So we were kind of forced to remove ourselves from the video games and start building our own version of the universe in which our characters would exist. So that's kind of when I started working in earnest on the story and on the world of Hedon. There's a forest in the first map of Hedon, and that's basically one of the first ideas that I had. And Zan was sort of like this adventure running around there and doing quests and killing bandits, the usual RPG stuff. Okay, so Zan is one of the main elements of Hedon. The world was built across the years. Uh, the orcs are also kind of interesting because orcs were generally that kind of evil, chaotic race, generic, very generic. And at some point, of course, I started playing Warcraft, and in their works had a bit of organization to them. They had a bit of deeper lore, deeper meaning to them, and I felt it was really interesting and refreshing. So it turned out to be one of my favorite fantasy races because they were kind of like different from the norm, which was like humans in shiny golden armor and dwarves and elves and whatever. I was like, orcs felt a lot cooler at that time, and they stuck with me. But of course, initially, they were kind of like standard orcs in the world. The Iron Division came to be from a necessity to be original. I was like, okay, I have to give them an edge. Like, it's fine, they exist, people know what an orc is, but I should give them an edge to be more different than the norm.
Definitely.
And I was like, what if instead of a regular orc faction, I just go with like an Amazon faction of orcs, like combine the Amazon, so it's a female only with like orcs. And what if I give them some kind of technology? And crystals were an idea that I had before, and they also fit well with the underground world. Now, I also had a lot of inspiration from Arx Fatalis and Ultima Underworld. These games really felt really interesting to me and very unique. And it's a mix of the underground atmosphere, but also the way these games worked and the way they had you figure out stuff and figure out where to go next. And sometimes I even had to like write down things. I really like that. If you couldn't tell, like I like being a bit puzzly about games.
Of course.
Yeah. So Crystal Tech, Amazon Orcs. The idea started to take root in my brain. I would sketch stuff, I would think about stuff, but at the end of the day, you have to understand that I'm an architect. I had no prior knowledge to game design, no coding resources, no nothing. So this was pretty much just an idea that I would just fantasize about and have some fun with it. Like I wasn't planning to make a serious game with it.
With the fact that you are professionally an architect, though, I do want to take a moment to kind of talk about some of the architecture in the game itself, which for the Doom engine is magnificent. I mean, this is probably one of the most beautiful anything ever created on the GZDoom engine or any Doom engine ever. The only other competitor that I would say is like clearly a lot more detail, than the normal Doom type thing goes into is like Total Chaos that Wadaholic created. And again, you guys are leveraging this engine, but making games that are not really akin to Doom at all, which people are not used to. That really catches people off guard. When they hear Doom engine, they just want Doom clone, and you guys are thinking about it in a totally different way. And when you said that you were not a game designer, like you came at this with a fresh set of eyes and just an idea of what you wanted to do. So with that said, why did you choose the Doom engine?
This is funny because this is how I basically got into game development. Okay, so I have to talk a bit about shooters first. I've always been a bit disenfranchised with how the industry was going, and I was literally just watching how shooters become dumber and dumber by the years. They were being streamlined, they were being turned into on-rails experience, cinematic experiences, and I just didn't like that. At that time, people were like, "Oh, you're just being a contrarian," but I felt something about it, and it wasn't something good.
You're safe on this podcast with that opinion. Trust me.
Yeah. So basically, the only like you have to understand that I didn't grow up playing retro shooters. I had no idea about Doom, about Quake. My first shooter was Delta Force, and that kind of turned me into a milsim guy, like military simulators. I'm
Yeah.
kind of a fan of them, Delta Force, Arma, Operation Flashpoint, and so on. And I had, when I was a kid, I had Serious Sam: The Second Encounter. So that was like the closest thing to a retro shooter that I would play. And the first time I played a retro shooter was, again, I was kind of like 12, 13, I don't know. It was Duke 3D basically, but it already had the 3D and the eDuke 32 updates. Like it had a polymer renderer, and I played like the first time I played it, it already had like full 3D graphics. I know that some people really hate that, but for me, it was like the original experience. Like I never played that game with sprites. Yeah, but aside from that, time went on, and I didn't like what happened with shooters. And one day I saw this Total Biscuit made a video about this problem, and he had Shadow Warrior on the case. He was like playing Shadow Warrior and talking about the old design versus the new design, and that it's a pretty popular video. I think people know about it. And that got me thinking. It got me trying out the game, and I was like, yeah, this is what I'm talking about. Like, there was a kind of freedom and a kind of careful handmade design that I really loved about that game. And I would just go on and try out the other shooters like Blood, Sin, again, a very amazing and underrated game. And eventually, I found out about Brutal Doom. So this is the cornerstone of my entry in the game development. Um, Now, Brutal Doom, you have to understand that I didn't play it as a mod for Doom. It had that, what is it called? Hell on Earth starter pack, which
Yep.
basically
Yep.
combines Brutal Doom with the Extermination Day map pack. And dude, as soon as I opened that up and I heard like metal music and marine chatter and stuff, and seeing all that satisfying violence and how good the weapons felt, I was like, okay, this is just perfect for me. And yeah, that thing turned out to be one of my favorite FPS experiences ever. Like, yeah, it's a lot of stuff that I love about it. And one of the things I really loved about it was it combined, Sergeant Mark IV is kind of a gun guy himself, like you can see in Viet Doom that he's working on right now, that he knows his guns. And I appreciated that as a milsim guy, because you could like aim down the sights. The shotgun was relatively accurate at ranges. You had all these little details from realistic shooters, but merged into Doom. So that sort of made me really like the game. Not to mention the segments where you would have allies and you could like go a bit tactical with them, and that transitioned into Hedon as well. Okay, so I was mind blown by it, and then I found out that Sergeant Mark IV was previously a Warcraft 3 mapper, and I was like, okay, so you can just learn how to do this like all by yourself, and yeah, that's how I said, okay, fuck it, I'm gonna get working on my own game now.
Well, that's really good that you kind of started with you knew what your end goal was, and I've talked to a couple of other people with kind of a similar story where like you have a mapped out idea of what kind of story you want to tell and what kind of game you want it to be, but then you have to like figure out everything else on the way. But that gives you the motivation, like keeps driving you towards that goal.
Yeah, and this is something that I tell to people. I didn't choose GZDoom engine because it's I wanted to make something retro. No, I wanted to make something retro, and I asked myself, what's the best engine to do this?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
Because you already have the tools. I mean, that's what I wanted to make. I wanted like Doom-like combat with Hexen-like inventory. Of course, some scripts, but that's not really unfamiliar to the engine, and that was it. I didn't want to expand the engine or anything.
So then you have like all of the little details of learning how to map and everything. How did you tackle that? Were you using Trench Broom or like what kind of tools were made available to you? And who are you communicating with?
Yeah, that's the thing. I luckily I had this. I mean, it wasn't even a friend. I had an acquaintance that I knew that was making Doom maps,
Okay.
and I asked him like, okay, dude, I want to start doing this. What do I need? And that person was very patient with me. They told me, you need to. We basically have like the Doom editor and the Slade 3, which is like the resource manager for the game archive. You mix your assets with the code in there, and dude, it was really hard. Like my brain was just not wired to understand how game is supposed to function. So it took me just days just to comprehend like what's the link between. I mean, I would understand that you have to like put an asset in there and then link it with code, but that was it. Like everything else I had to like search and ask. Now, okay, ZDoom has a really good Wikipedia with like documentation, and you can also ask on the forums, and people are very helpful. And yeah, I kind of like inched my way into it like this. And I started, well, first of all, I made like a test map to learn the editor, which wasn't that hard. Like that's the easy part in my opinion if you want to start this. And then what I did was like, okay, let's make a hub area, something simple. I had some textures left over from when I helped a friend of mine with a project. Like he was trying to make some sort of Terraria clone for mobile, but for some reason it never worked, and I still had a bunch of textures. And some of these textures are actually still in the game, and it's kind of funny because it's those layered grass with stone textures that sort of like give it that Minecraft look that some people mentioned about, and that's why it looks like Minecraft, because it was meant for a 2D Minecraft game, which is kind of hilarious. Uh, and I had these textures, I just slapped them in there, and I was like, okay, now I have to make a weapon. So I would just look up a tutorial or something and just bang my head against the wall until I came up with something. And that was the spike gun. It's the first gun in the game. And, I just kept going on like this. Like, okay, I have the weapon, I have the graphics. Okay, I learned how to make the animations. Okay, now I need sounds. Time to find out about Audacity, time to find out about Creative Commons. Oh, yeah, this is important. I didn't intend Hedon to be a game, like a commercial game. I always said, because back then, GZDoom required a Doom mod to function. So technically, you just couldn't make a commercial game because you had to like include a set of assets that was copyrighted, which is either Doom or Freedom or, yeah, you get it.
Right.
So I wasn't setting off to make a commercial game. I was just like, I'm just gonna make something. Maybe if it goes well, I'll open a Patreon for it. If people like it, they'll donate, whatever. But I always said that I'm going to make it at as much as I can at the commercial standards. So no copyrighted assets, no legal issues with it from the get-go. And yeah, I had to pick up Audacity. Luckily, I have a good ear, so I was pretty decent at mixing sounds to make them interesting. Like, I had some weird sounds, like for the spike gun, that sound when you pick a mag or you pick the spike gun is just the sound of a stapler, and it's pretty interesting. I mean, it sounds really good.
Yes, I was gonna literally part of my notes was like to tell you how amazing I thought the sound design to this game was, but that's so funny, man.
Yeah, there's a lot of funny stuff. Like for some of the fire sounds, like the texture of the sound is from the rain falling on the ground. It sort of gave that warm wood cackling noise. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like an opposite sound of water, but it sounds like fire. And there's a bunch of interesting stuff like that. And I just went like this. I would then just be okay. Time to make the first map. So I started making. Initially, the game had the start was in the caves. There wasn't that hell segment. I'll get to this later. But yeah, the caves, I started making the caves. I need the sprites to fill them up with. I need assets, and I would just go like that, step by step, very slowly, but eventually it started going better. And yeah, regarding my initial intentions, I was like, okay, I'm doing this in my spare time. I'm not going to make money out of this. I'm doing this because I'm fed up with the AAA industry and what they do. So the logic answer is to just make something that's very against mainstream. And of course, the first thing I went with was like a very enigmatic level, something that could genuinely piss people off, and go back to some of the principles of the old games, like I always said that the dead end, the dead end, every AAA developer, if you tell them about dead ends, they'll be like, that's like the worst thing you can do in a level. But I was like, what if you can use it to maybe give your level an edge and like put it somehow in a composition with the rest of the level, have the dead end suggest maybe a path or increase the complexity of the map, but not necessarily be something bad or like a dead weight. And that's what the first level was about. It was about backtracking and figuring out what you have to do. Of course, at first it was a bit different. It was like a lot more enigmatic than it is right now. Like right now, for example, you have that first locked door that basically seals off half of it. Initially, that thing didn't exist there, and people had to actually figure out that in the mossy cave, how you go to the right, you actually have to jump on those things. It was really cryptic, and some people loved it. Like I got some really nice feedback, and that made me motivated. So I just went on with that kind of design that just I knew wasn't for everyone, and I would assume that. But I was like, if you're an indie dev, don't do what the industry is doing. Like you need to fill some demands that people have left, that the industry just can't satisfy. That's why indies exist.
That's one of the things that over the past several days I've been streaming myself play through the game, and you're right, it is very frustrating and very puzzling, but a lot of people jump in and ask, like, "Hey," because anybody who watches my stream knows that it's mostly like this type of game, like these retro shooters and Doom mods and everything like that. And they look at Hedon and they're like, "Oh, okay, so do you think I should try this out?" And my first reaction is like, "Yeah, I think you should try it out." But if you're expecting to just zip through this in a couple of days or whatever, like don't walk into this game thinking that it's something that it's not. And I think that's a pretty challenging thing for you in general, was to try to get past that initial assumptions that people were going to make about it and just sell the game that you wanted to. But also is the fact that you have repeated several times how you're saying, I wanted to go against the industry and I don't, I'm fed up with the way that they do things and everything like that. And that's exactly kind of what this show has been about from the get go. But I would also say that you've basically indirectly stated that you've made this for the sake of making something for yourself. It wasn't like you were attempting to you never were trying to sell anybody
Exactly.
on your
Yeah.
idea. Yeah, there's like, I want to make this because I'm passionate about it.
Yeah, Hedon was initially a game for myself and myself only. And if people like it, that's great.
It's the perfect, in my opinion, that's the kind of art I want to consume. I don't want stuff that's made for the masses, and I never have. Like, I've just never been that kind of person.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think people are hungry for stuff. Like, I've said this many times over the course of several different interviews, but I really do think that the way to really make your name in this industry is not to have a bunch of people buy your game and then never think about you again in 2 years from then. It's to create something that is true to yourself, and then the people who do end up playing it and do end up liking it are going to really like it because they had to put some investment, personal investment, into
Yeah, exactly.
appreciating your project. Yeah.
And I've just had people telling me that this is the best. This is my top 5 shooters I've ever played, and it's amazing. Like you're a nobody, and people tell you that. Like, how does that feel?
I've had a lot of people like posting on Twitter or just in general commenting about this game that it's, clearly, and I've said that myself, it's not for everybody, but for the people that it's for, it's really, really for them. Like, they love it and they're probably going to stick with you, and, whatever you end up creating, even if it weren't a video game, they'd probably be like, "Hey, let's go check out what Zand's doing," because you had touched them with your art.
Yeah. Now, of course, there has to be a balance, and as I said, like the first map was really, really patched a lot of times in order to, because you generally want to have people give you a chance. It's not about appeasing to them, but it's about telling them, hey, this is a bit hard, this is a bit obscure, but at the same time, look, there's maybe something more. There will be more action in the future, or you have to give them a bit of incentive to play your game.
Of course.
One of the things I stuck to with Hedon was the pacing of the entire campaign. I had this scheme in my mind in which, if you notice, the first 2 maps are pretty puzzling and pretty, intertwining and complex and stuff. But then the third map is pretty straightforward. Like, it's the barracks map where you just have 2 paths, which are pretty much linear. Then you have a big battle, and again, it's kind of linear. So I was like, the player starts playing this. They have the most enthusiasm and energy at the start. Later on, I have to do something, because if I keep the levels being cryptic, then it will just become jarring to them. So I have to have these moments of breathing space and of relaxation, a bit, like make stuff a bit more streamlined. And yeah, I went with some sort of scheme involving the general pacing across the levels. And this is also one of the reasons why Hedon has a bit of variation to it. Like,
Yeah.
it's not really fitting into one genre.
It kind of takes you across several different genres in the course of the game. Like, you start off, and as you said, the first 2 levels are these cryptic, that you have like the dead end paths where you like come up on a door or, a portal or whatever it happens to be. And you're like, okay, no, you read something in that room that tells you how to obtain passage through there. So then you have to go back and find something else. And you do a lot of that. And then you get that change of pace in level 3 where you get to kind of just like run through and mow down a bunch of enemies. And it's really fun. And then later on in the game, and I'm not trying to spoil it too much, but I feel like a lot of the people, are gonna want to play it because I'm saying this. Then you kind of get this part where like your levels are your weapons are gone, and then you have to be stealthy, and you just kind of ingest some story and take a break from the fast paced action that you've been playing through a lot of the
Yeah,
time.
that's the mid game break. It's
Right.
a break intended to like relax the player a bit and shift the tone a bit.
And expand on the story too. Like, that's an expert design in my opinion. Is that like though this is different, it serves a purpose. It's not there for no reason. Like you get to just lean back and like kind of learn a little bit about what the character is doing a lot more because it's hard for a lot of people, especially younger people who are playing games like this. They're not used to reading through things. They just want fast paced story fed to them, or like moving cinematic pieces and everything. And you mix that really well with it's really beautiful and also simplistic, like especially the parts in the underworld or Hedon or whatever you want to call it, where you see the illumination of a character, and then you have a monologue from the antagonist kind of telling you, okay, this is what you're looking at, and then here's the story behind it. But it doesn't ever feel like, oh God, why am I sitting here watching this at any point? At least not to me.
Yeah, and there's also the soundtrack, which was very important. It's kind of funny, but I had to actually expand this level to adjust it to the soundtrack. And this is not something that I've done only once. Yeah, I actually, Akzul, which is like the dedicated composer of the first level soundtrack, he would sometimes just send me a track, and I would like uh, drip into the mood and like try to adjust the level a bit to fit the soundtrack. But this is more apparent to the licensed soundtracks. In that case, in Map 6, it's like Methadone Skies, which is like a instrumental stoner rock band, which I really love. And I reached out to them. I really loved that song. And I was like, okay, how am I gonna fit the level around this song?
That's really interesting, actually. That's a different kind of level design, you know?
Yeah, there's bits of that around the places. Yeah.
So has music always been something really important to you in that regard?
Well, yeah, I'm also gonna talk about Alexander Brandon because at some point he complained that media today sort of has like it's the same thing as with games. Soundtracks just go into the background, they just fade in there, like they're good but they don't stand out, they don't you know you're gonna enjoy the moment, you're gonna enjoy the music, but at the end of the day you're not gonna remember the song or hum it in the back of your brain. It's very shy stuff. So I was like, okay, fuck it. I like a certain type of music, and that's why you hear both metal and electronic stuff and some ambient stuff. And if people like it, they'll love it. If people hate it, they'll hate it. And trust me, there are some people who really don't like the metal parts or some of the music in the game. But again, it's a music that stands out, and that's what impressed me. Also impressed me about Brutal Doom. It had all these metal pieces and like the Andrew Holschultz remixes of the Quake stuff. They were really standing out. It was amazing.
I think that's an important part of everything, and it's kind of one of those things again that you only really see in independent games. I would say uh, some of the music that we've seen come out of the recent Doom games, regardless of how anybody feels about the games, like the music itself is like exactly that kind of thing where like this music really drives the pace of the game and feels like the right kind of music for the storytelling they're going for. And with your game, I felt the same way. I do want to get on a brief tangent at least about the characters themselves and what they look like, because this is like they're like these fantasy orc pinup girls, a lot of them, and they're like kind of thicker than a bowl of oatmeal and sort of sexy, depending on how you want to look at that. But that is it's something that people take away from the game. And then with that is like they kind of feel almost fantasy or anime ish, or it might appeal to that genre of people. And then the music kind of sets the tone, and that it does uh, remind me of something like Elfen Lied or something like Fully Cooley, that people might gravitate towards that sort of storytelling and that sort of character. So when you were drawing the characters, what was your kind of intention?
Okay, so yeah, I actually explained this to my Patreons, but Zan is basically it was one of the first animated characters that had legs. So you have to understand that I'm basically drawing them up from scratch in Photoshop, which is pretty nice for sprites and for textures. But when it comes to animation, it just turns into hell because I sort of like have to draw each part of the body on a different layer. And then when I animate, I sort of like just manipulate these body parts like it's a doll.
Okay.
With Zen, it's a bit more weird because of my lack of experience. First of all, I didn't know about the thing in Doom in which you have to like Doom itself, or at least GZDoom, scales stuff on the vertical axis. Like it stretches stuff on vertical axis. So I didn't know that you could manually scale sprites on the different axes. So what I would do is I would just make stuff wider than normal. So when it goes into the engine, it would just be auto-corrected. So that's the intention I had with Zand. So from the get-go, I sort of like made her thicker. And yeah, the animation also contributed to her like having a very ample torso because I needed space for the joints of the legs, so I didn't have to like redraw everything. I could just edit the stuff, and this is probably the weakest thing in Hedon. Like the animations, they're not just that great. Like I'm not super happy with them, but I think they do the job at the end of the day. So I'm not gonna complain too much about them.
Oh, it's a good inconvenience. I think that's part of some of the appeal to it is like, oh yeah, well you get to play as like this sexy orc.
Yeah, people keep telling me like, why don't you just use 3D models? And I'm like, yeah, that would be a really good idea, and it would save me a lot of time and effort, but it would also kill like the spirit that these things have. Like they have their own soul and appeal that I just don't want to change, even if they're janky. So yeah, that's kind of it. The rest of the orcs are a bit more tame, but again, it was just a matter of I want to see sexy chicks in my games. There's not a lot of them in serious games, so just let's make it.
So back to kind of the musical tangent. When you're, for example, the parapet, right? This is one of the more puzzling levels that I've gotten to, and you have all the the machinery and everything going on, and you have like these wide open spaces where you get to battle a lot of enemies and these really tall towers and beautiful scenery and everything. And so, did you create levels like this with the song already in mind, and then I'm going to create a level around that song, or did you like have a selection of music to choose from, and then kind of see what fits into what you're going for? Because as you said, you had a combination of like composed music, and you had a some music that was commercial that you reached out to people to get. I'm just wondering which ones are which.
Yeah, for that particular level, again, it's Alexander Brandon. It's one of his personal tracks, but that particular track reminded me of Unreal very much and his work in Unreal.
Yeah.
And that's the theme of the level. Like when the music starts playing on the elevator and then that gate opens, the first thing you see is like this brown metal and like sparks and electric stuff. And for me, I don't know, that was the image of Unreal from my childhood. So I went with an image, but at the same time, I sort of like uh, went my own way. Like I didn't look at Unreal and like, okay, let's take this, take this, take this. No, I just took an image from it, a mental image from it, something very sensitive.
Also wanted to ask, because we mentioned earlier kind of you didn't intend for the game to be commercialized, and then later on you decided to sell it. Did you decide I need to get rid of the dot wad and everything, and how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, so when I made the game, I said, okay, even if I make this very seriously, I'm just gonna release whatever I release for free. And very late, I think it was like the game was already mostly finished, and I was like doing the final patching to it. I had a friend who told me, hey, why don't you just put this on Steam? I'm like, can you do that? And they're like, yeah, GZDoom recently got rid of the necessity to run with an iWAD, so you can literally just turn your own game into an iWAD, and that's what Hedon is today. And I was like, yeah, why the fuck not? But the game is still available for free. Like you have to understand
Yeah.
that I had a free release on the GZDoom forums, and then I was like, okay, this is the first episode. From now on, if I want to keep working on this and take it seriously, I should be making some money out of it. So I went to Steam, and yeah, when you go to Steam, you have like an absolute explosion of exposure. Like I had people mailing me for reviews. I had a lot of people looking at it, playing it, streaming it. Like it was a huge influx of feedback. And at first, it was really difficult because I had to just start adjusting a lot of stuff and start patching a lot of stuff, and a lot of bugs were showing up. So that's why uh, the Steam version got to be quite more polished than the free one. And it also has like the Berserk difficulty, which was a later addition to it. But in the future, I'm just gonna work on episode 2, and I'm not promising anything. But there is also a chance for someone making an expansion for Hedon, which again I want to release for like free.
That's really cool. I know a lot of people were kind of off put by that. I think there's just this tradition within the Doom community of like everything has to be given away for free or whatever because it's all like based on an engine that was given away to us for free. I don't know. I don't know why they have that. There's nothing wrong with that,
Uh,
and it's bred a lot of good
you
things.
know,
But
it's not everyone. Like a lot of people were supportive. I think it's just some few loud people about this.
yeah, a vocal minority. I'm just saying that I think you put a lot of time and effort, and there's no real assets that you shared from anybody else's game at all. This is a complete work of art, and I think that to motivate you to continue to make it, like or whatever, like or to justify the time that you've put into it, of course you should make some money. Like I 100% support that.
Yeah, and I also had to like figure out what's the best model to go by. And that's why I made a Patreon page, because the idea is like, okay, I'm gonna make a game that appeals to a narrow number of people, a niche.
Mhm.
So it's logical to just have some of my income come from people that are interested in this, and then just try to go with the lowest price possible on a store to just allow to make the game more accessible to people. That's the idea. Like I want
Right.
people to be at least exposed to it, and that's also why I tell them about the free version. Of course, I can't say there's a free version on the Steam store because Valve's gonna get pissed about it. But every time I can, I just tell them, hey, you can get this for free.
You talked earlier about the guns in Brutal Doom and how they kind of shaped your opinion on this game and how you wanted to design the weapons. And I think that's really interesting because the weapons are all clearly like just these made up fantasy things, but they function uh, in really interesting ways. For instance, you mentioned earlier the spike gun, the spike shooter, and I noticed after a bit, like, okay, this is basically a machine gun. It's got its own kind of sound going on, but you can also like aim it down sight and you get like a 3 round burst, just like when you're shooting an M16. And I just thought that was like, okay, cool. Like this guy really gets what he's doing here. And then you go on and there's really interesting weapons. You have like the kind of shotgun esque weapon, and you have a rocket launcher, which is like a crossbow. And like, how did you kind of think up what sorts of weapons you wanted to have in the game, and then kind of lay out the progression of how the player would pick them up and interact with the environment with them?
Yeah, the idea and the design ties into my previous story about how the lore of the game evolved. And I basically, like, all these weapons had some stages in my brain. Like, I still have some old paper sketches with their old designs. The spy gun was looking really different initially. But yeah, I would just develop like the weapon. It's sort of like a mix between trying to be original, trying to be functional, but at the same time trying to have a bit of logic behind these weapons. Let's not just make something that's ridiculous. Like for example, the spike gun is essentially a crystal powered Gauss rifle. You know, it has some metal coils inside, powered by crystals. Okay, it shoots spikes. It's not entirely realistic or feasible, but it has a bit of logic behind the design. I just developed them for a long time, and I think that's why they came out to be pretty good and pretty different from one each other, because I just took my time designing them, and they had like multiple phases. Like for example, the potion launcher was initially supposed to shoot random potions that had similar effects. And it was like, you know, acid, fire, frost potion stuff that was just randomly coming out of it. But you know, I was like, yeah, if I implement this in the game, it might just end up being annoying. So you know, let's just think about narrowing them down and making the weapon a bit more stable. So I was like, okay, I'll just use the toxic potions and the acid potions.
Then you get the ability to choose between your ammo, which is a roundabout way of getting back to a something that's pretty common in weapon game development. It's just like you have alt fires or different types of ammo. So that's a good way of looking at it too.
Yeah, it was interesting to try to balance these weapons around. Like for example, the frag fire gun shoots frag and shoots also fire, but I had to use the same ammo source. So how do I make this weapon like both the fires usable and not just have the players just using one of the fire modes? And you know, it's just about giving monster their resistances. Like demons, okay, are resistant to fire. They don't enter pain states from fire, so the flamethrower is more useful against humans or bunched up enemies. But then again, there were concerns regarding the range of the flamethrower, the speed, the spread, stuff like that. Like I just had to constantly tinker with these parameters, and
Yeah.
I did a lot of this through the feedback that I received and from watching people play the game.
It's especially because it's some of the enemies are kind of akin to enemies in Doom in that, you even have the robot. Well, I call them cacodemons, but I understand that they're their own thing. And then when they explode, then you get like the suicide bomber things flying towards you. They're very harkening back to Doom with those
Yeah,
enemies.
there's a good
And
reason for this. It's because I wanted Hedon to be compatible with Doom maps at a later point.
yeah,
So it's like you can play Hedon on a vanilla Doom, and you're not gonna have bugs. Like if there's a place that's inaccessible and it's supposed to spawn a cacodemon, the cacodemon replacement from Hedon is the warlock. They can still fly. Like it's a flying enemy. It's somewhat similar, and so on. The weapons
right.
are again. It's like the pistol is the spy gun. You start with it, and there's the shotgun, which is the frag fire cannon, and so on.
I just dig that you obviously had to kind of engineer your way out of issues, and luckily you had the help and feedback of people to do it. But one of the things that you have to do when you're creating weapons, at least if you want it to be, it's different for something like Russian Overkill, where it's just supposed to be outlandish and crazy. But you wanted these weapons to feel like they make sense, and that you have to make decisions about what weapons you're going to use against different enemies and everything. And
Yeah,
to
and this shows in the axe
yeah,
most than anything else because I was like, it's just a pity. A lot of games have melee weapons, but they're not really that useful in combat. So, I
right.
thought about ways in which I could make the axe viable later on in the game, and I was like, okay, what if you throw it? That was a pretty good idea, and a lot of people just love that. It's like the hallmark of Hedon's weapons.
One of my favorite things about Hedon is that when I run out of ammo or at any point in time when I'm in a fight with a lot of people, I just take one of those the potions that slows down time or crystals, time crystals, and
Time
then
charge, yeah.
break out the axe and just start whacking enemies' heads off. And it's like one of the most satisfying things about this game is that you can kind of play with that. And a lot of people I think are gonna maybe miss that when they first start playing,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
maybe
they
the
do.
first playthrough. I did for the whole first level, and once I figured that out, I'm like, "Oh, yeah," and then you have, several different things that you've implemented into the game, like, just that can kind of be used tactically, and that's not something that's almost it's weird to say this, but a tactical game built into Doom is just so it's always exciting for me, at least.
Yeah, it's like the combat itself is a puzzle. That's
Yeah.
the idea.
It's so fun.
And this also ties in a bit to how I designed Head-On. Like, one thing I liked about old games is that there was that process of learning. The game was you had to use your own resources to understand the game. You would either read the manual or you would experiment with things. But nowadays, games sort of like try to put everything into your face, and that's not just saying that there's a tip telling you, okay, this weapon can do that. This also reflects in the level design. Like they just try to force the player to use weapons at the right time or items. They just create this environment in which suggests the use of what they should use basically. This isn't by no means bad level design. I think it's just that Valve had a lot of influence with Half-Life and their design ideas. Like, you should subtly tell the player what to do. But I think there's also alternatives to that. And, Valve kind of destroyed the build engine slash Quake slash Doom kind of games because they introduced that kind of design in which you have to be very careful towards the player and always make sure that you're holding their hand, even if that hand is invisible and you're not directly pointing them to where they have to go. And that translates to also the use of inventory items, the use of weapons. Like, you don't know that the pink gas from the potion launcher is flammable. You can read about it, you can deduct that from reading the text, but some people don't read the text and they just find out that it explodes watching a Cerberus shoot fire into it. And they're like, okay, I can do that. And for me, that's important. Like the player just has fun learning and finding out these things.
Yeah. Even with the Iron Maidens, like, using the gas against them is really satisfying too. You shoot the
Yeah,
poison gas, and then they stall in the area, and at first, I was just kinda sitting there, like, watching them choke on poison, and then I'd keep doing it slowly, and then I realized, like, after a certain point, I think another enemy, like, fired into it or, like, crashed into it, exploded, and then everything lit up, and then now I'm like, "Oh, yeah, we've got a whole new way to take out these." The Iron Maidens are really interesting enemy, and I actually wanna go on a tangent about them.
Yeah, the funny thing about them is that there's just so many surefire ways to kill them, but the players
Yeah.
just have to experiment. Like one way is just to shoot a fire at them because you hit them up even if they have the shield that they set up on fire. Another way is to just use the old fire of the crush bow. A lot of people don't use the old fire, which is basically kind of like the crossbow from Dusk, but it doesn't go through walls. Like it's a Reaper projectile. It just punches through multiple enemies, and it's very fast as well. And it punches through the shield as well. A lot of people never use the old fire of the crossbow, and I'm still struggling to like give them a hint. There is like that text next where you pick it up in the shooting range in the barracks map, but I don't know.
Well, that said, there are a lot of weapons in the game that like you don't really assume this has an alt fire, and then you kind of like accidentally hit it. That's how it happened for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You can also just shoot acid at them, which again makes sense because it goes through iron, and acid is also very useful against forge elementals and the urchins because again they're made from iron. Like if you kill a forge elemental using acid, it won't spawn any urchins. But these are subtle things that the player should notice in time and learn about it. Now, regarding architecture, I had to like combine the real architecture with like functionality with the
Mhm.
game itself because at the end of the day in reality you have concerns regarding structure, regarding safety measures and so on, but in the game you need to think about uh, how large a space is, how the player can like adapt to a space. You can't just make the same room sizes because if you put something from real life into a game it might just not work. Like it might just get clunky and get into the way, so I had to like find a balance between functionality and make a game design. And again, Hedon is a kind of game that focuses on, it's not realism, it's authenticity. I wanted to make a world that makes sense in itself. Like there's even the smallest building has some sort of purpose or some sort of story behind it. The plaza, for example, which is the second map, there's a hierarchy between the middle spaces. You start off with the taxing office, then you have the guardhouse, you have a tavern. Like all this stuff just makes sense from a functional standpoint. And then I just sort of like try to merge that with a bit of non-linear design and see how I place the locked doors, how I make the puzzles. Maybe I just make a breakable wall, maybe I just put a switch there, and it sort of had to strike a balance between realism and game design.
Yeah, and it's some of the most beautiful like architecture, as I said earlier, that I've ever seen in anything created on the Doom engine. Like it's just absolutely magnificent and kind of inspiring, like because people always think that they know the limits of something until they see someone kind of come in and do a Jimi Hendrix on it. Like, oh, you can do that with that thing or that instrument or that, you know, whatever it happens to
Yeah,
be.
but at the same time, I didn't try to expand further than what the GZDoom engine can do, because I try to stick to what it is meant to do, and
Right.
oftentimes I had to make some detailed areas, and then I had to remove stuff from them because it was affecting performance. That was another issue I had. Like for example, in the parapet map, you have the area with the towers, which looks a bit flat. There's no light. There's no, it's a bit open and empty, and that's mainly because I had to just sacrifice space, sacrifice buildings, remove trees because I had to like optimize it. So at the end of the day, I try to stay true to GZDoom and not make any compromise of this sort.
All right. I really appreciate you coming on the show, Zan.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I don't know what to say. Thanks for doing this because one thing is making the game, another is playing it, and but most importantly, you need to have someone to tell people about the game. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad to do that. It's my favorite thing, really, just to talk about the things that I really enjoy and to kind of open my eyes to new things too sometimes because, as I said, come into it with certain expectations and I was treated to like a whole different style of gameplay that I'm not really like an expert on or like that I don't spend a lot of time doing. So with that said, you did give a little bit of a plug earlier into that you would like to release perhaps an expansion, but for you personally, Do you see yourself continuing down the path of a game dev, or is this like a one-off for you? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of future ideas, and not just for Hedon, but for future games.
All right, well, when you get ready to release something or you want to announce something, man, you're always invited to come back on the show. I feel like we'll never run out of stuff to talk about.
Yeah, sure. I would love that.
In the Keep is a listener-supported podcast and also a player-supported community. We depend on you to keep the lights on. And I want to say thank you to all of the people who are already giving in some way. So Dots, Moose, Paul, Zach, Alexander, Lashaka, Brad, Night Owl, Tones, Jeffrey, Larissa, Nabe, Steve, NVZ, Catman, Samiko, Chibi Sniper, and Donkey. Thank you all. These are all people who have given on Patreon, PayPal, through their credit cards, doing their shopping with our Amazon affiliate link, buying merchandise on our Redbubble page, or becoming Nitro boosters for our Discord, which is a big help in, just for having fun in the Discord, but also the sound quality of the podcast, because many of them are recorded through Discord. Huge, huge thanks to each and every one of you. If you are out there listening and you'd like to join up with these people, you can go to inthekeep.com and find all of our support links right there on that page. Patreon subscribers get the podcast early, as well as, merchandise perks and everything like that. So consider doing that if you want to. Really appreciate it. And hey, if you don't have the cash, or you don't have, whatever, maybe you just don't want to, please stay along for the ride. The best thing that you can do for the Keep is to spread the word. And I'm serious, go out and tell people, tell your friends, tell people that you think would be interested. Share it on your social media. Don't just like it, retweet it, post it, whatever. If you like it, scream it from the rooftops. Show the drowned god Cathala what you're made of. We're also brought to you by a few different organizations. I want to say thank you to QuakeFans.net, your home online for all things arena first-person shooters. You can also go to RocketJump.zone, a community of people who put on some really incredible tournaments, mostly for Quake Champions lately, but we'll see what they get into in the future, and hopefully we'll get to hear from them pretty soon on the show. State of Quake, longtime supporters, they founded this show essentially and helped us get it off the ground, but they're back doing King of the Hill, so if you're a State of Quake fan, get back in there and play in one of those tourneys. Multiplayer Doom Federation, we support them. I also recommend you check out their podcast, which I produce, called Doom is Dead Podcast, and tell them Motherload sent you. And finally, the US Quake community. What is there not to say? This is an amazing community of people playing all things arena shooters, but mostly, Quake and Doom and stuff like that. And just, you can always depend on them for a great time. That's all for me. Till next time, stay in the Keep.